Hey everyone, I'm going to do a review of the Great Depression, Great Crash, and New Deal unit. Sorry for the quality, I decided just to go ahead and just do it sitting at my computer instead of putting the whole green screen behind me and doing my setup for that. I didn't think you'd mind. This one's going to be pretty long because I'm going to try to go through the entire Great Depression and New Deal unit, including things that I've seen on past ACE exams, some things that aren't actually in the book and don't really look like they should be in the syllabus, but that's a completely different rant because there are things that are most definitely not on that syllabus or topics that don't really look like they'd be covered by the syllabus that have popped up on past ACE exams. So anything that I've seen like that, I'm going to cover in this video. I'll put it up on the screen record in just a second. It's going to be on like a PDF because I use a Mac for my videos at home where my work computer is Microsoft and I don't have PowerPoint on here, so I'm just going to do it through the PDF format. So if you found these videos useful to you at all, please subscribe to this channel, or since I know that you probably this might be your only ACE history class you're taking, and I'm really focusing on US here, so this won't be that useful of a channel for you after next Wednesday whenever your ACE exam is taken. That's fine. I have another YouTube channel called Weave TV that has nothing to do with history, and it's just me being really silly. But if you want to pay thanks to me for helping you out, go on over to Weave TV and subscribe there, maybe watch some videos to help you take a break. So let's go ahead and get started looking at the Great Depression New Deal unit. All right, the Great Depression and New Deal unit. So I'll try to cover every possibility of things that could potentially show up on your ACE exam, including things that have shown up on past ACE exams, and I'll try to go in depth as much as possible to cover absolutely everything. Now this would be in PowerPoint form. This is 70 slides or 70 different pages, as you can see up here at the top. So we've got quite a bit to cover in this video. First up, this has been an actual question before, so we're going to start with the 1920s. The ACE question, I believe this was from 2018, one of the 2018 ones for Region 3, I believe. There was a question about how did race relations change throughout the 1920s. This would work perfectly in a progressive era unit discussing the failures of the progressive era, but no, they threw it in the Great Depression. Does it actually have anything to do with the Great Depression or the Great Crash? Absolutely not, but I mean, it is what it is. It was on a past ACE question, so just in case you get something like this, let's go ahead and cover it first. So first up, during the 1920s, there was the Red Scare. You had Russian communists. There were the Bolsheviks that seized power in Russia during the First World War in November of 1917. A couple things about the Russian communists that spread the Bolsheviks. They were opposed to private property rights. They were against religious beliefs and the whole idea of free enterprise, so the state control over economic production. So as a result of this, these are all pretty anti-American things. You know, Americans love their private property. Americans tend to be extremely religious, and we like the idea of starting your own business and not having the government control over that. So as a result, communism is seen as anti-American, and Americans begin fearing the possibility of communism spreading to the United States. This was also a fear within Europe at this time as the like Germany collapses, their German empire, they collapse, they're starting a new form of government. That's a fear in Germany. That also begins to be a fear in France after World War I with how much devastation there was in that country. So the Red Scare kind of swept the Europe and the United States, but this is where it really gets going, is after World War I. So this fear of communism is known as the Red Scare because red is the color of communism. That's associated with it. As part of the Red Scare, the United States started having something known as Palmer raids, which they're arresting any foreign-born radical. So if you're an immigrant to the United States, especially Eastern European, and you're very active either in labor unions or maybe you're an anarchist, the Palmer raids were aimed at going after them. So many of these people that were actually arrested and deported were linked to communist organizations. And as a result of the Palmer raids, you had labor unions greatly weakened and workers' organizations greatly weakened because they were often associated with socialism and communism. one of the big cases that came out of the Red Scare was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. These were two Italian immigrants. They were Niccolo Sacca and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They get arrested in 1920 for murders that were committed during a robbery. This would be in Massachusetts. Sacco and Vanzetti were very well-known anarchists. They opposed any type of organized government. They were also, like I said, at the top, and I mentioned that these are two Italian immigrants. So this kind of falls into that Red Scare there, that they're stirring up opposition to government, but also they're arguing for workers' rights as well. So when these murders get committed during this robbery, they get singled out as being the two people that committed these crimes. Now, there was actually not really any evidence linking them to the crime, and in fact, there was evidence that they had an alibi, but any evidence that was aimed at promoting their side was actually thrown out by the judge, so they didn't really get a fair trial, and they get convicted with very little evidence, and the two were executed for this crime. Going on with race relations is the immigration issue. During President Harding's term, the Immigration Quota Act of 1921 is passed. So basically, it restricted the amount of people that could come and see the United States, all the way down to 350,000 immigrants allowed per year. The main goal of this is because at this time, during the end of the 19-teens and the early 1920s, you had a lot of people coming over from Eastern and Southern Europe. Eastern and Southern Europeans tended to either be Catholic or Jewish. So the main goal here is to actually stop Catholic and Jewish immigration. And also a lot of people that would have been proponents of socialism and communism were coming from Eastern Europe at this time. So this is aimed really at, this kind of goes along with the Red Scare as well in that aspect. But like I said, this is really aimed at Catholics and Jews. Later on, when President Coolidge takes over after Harding, Coolidge also tightens immigration restrictions. He believes that what he referred to as Nordic people, so people from Northern and Western Europe, that they're racially and ethnically superior to every other group. Sounds a little bit like a guy from Germany that would be rising up at the end of this decade. And then under his presidency, he gets the Immigration Act of 1924 passed, which lowers even more the amount of immigrants that can enter into the country in a year to 150,000. Also, this one's also known as like the Quota Act or the National Origins Act, because they put quotas on which countries could have how many immigrants. So it was all determined by how many people immigrated in previous years. So and it was set a certain amount. So they would restrict you based off of how many immigrants were allowed previous year. So in other words, immigrants from England, there was allowed to be higher numbers of immigrants from England than there would be from Italy or from Russia. So this is often known as the National Origins Act, because it all depended on where you were coming from, how many people could come into the country. Also, in the 1920s, there was a rise in the Ku Klux Klan, a very massive rise in the Ku Klux Klan. Changed their ideology a bit. We often associate the Ku Klux Klan as just being anti-African American, but they expanded the reach of the groups that they were opposing, including to make themselves anti-immigrant. They believed that immigrants were coming into the country and competing for jobs and hurting the white Americans. They also became very anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish. Most of these new immigrants, like we previously just discussed, these were mostly Catholic or Jewish immigrants. So they expanded that as well. So they're really white. They're really supportive of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So Protestant religion, people that were coming from Northwestern Europe are the people that they're supporting. They also begin to become very anti-women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment is passed in 1919, and in 1920, women actually are allowed to start really voting. In the first presidential election, women can vote in, and they do not believe that women should have the right to vote. So they begin opposing women's suffrage. And of course, they always have been and remained anti-Black. Part of the spur for the growth of the Ku Klux Klan was actually the 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. Not to be confused with the movie that came out just a few years ago that I think intentionally used that name just to kind of as like imagery and just kind of like a screw you to this video, so to speak, or this movie rather. So The Birth of a Nation was this movie that really glorified the Klan. It takes place after the Civil War, so during the Reconstruction era, and the Ku Klux Klan members are actually the heroes of the film. So because of this film, the Ku Klux Klan gets glorified, and the Klan can use this as propaganda, and it helped grow their numbers. So they're viewed as heroic saviors of the South and also of white women. Continuing on with the Klan claimed that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were superior, and they supported and began promoting something that they referred to as 100% Americanism. And as you can see here on the chart, the growth of the Klan throughout the years. In 1868, when the Klan is established, it has about 550,000 members. By 1920, that number's up to 4 million. It had actually been dying out before the 1920s, but you don't really see that in these numbers. But in 1920, jumped up to 4 million. 1924, up to 6 million, which is the largest the Klan ever reached. And by 1930, though, it was down to 30,000. That's not a typo. It dropped down to 30,000. And that has a lot to do with the Great Depression actually hitting. By 1965, with the civil rights movement going on, it jumps back up to 35,000. Then by 2008, it was 6,000. And in 2012, it was down to 5,000. I don't have recent numbers, though, for you guys, but I'm sure you can do a little bit of research if you're interested to see where that Ku Klux Klan membership numbers are currently at. So for African Americans in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance was occurring. This was the outpouring of African American art, music, and literature during the 1920s. Some of the big notable people from the Harlem Renaissance were Zora Neale Hurston, who's from Florida, and an author. She wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God. Langston Hughes, the noted poet. You had Duke Ellington, from musician, coming around. Jazz gets extremely popular at this time, and that would be African American music that was gaining prominence. So the Harlem Renaissance really transformed American culture in general, because you had African American art becoming really absorbed and accepted, so to speak, by the entirety of the US populace. So it becomes more embedded into American culture and becomes less strictly African American culture and really just more American culture, because it becomes embraced. So African Americans, at least art wise, are becoming more ingrained into American society at this point. Also, with the African Americans, you had the Great Migration occurring at the end of World War I throughout the 1920s. This was when about 2 million Southern Blacks moved to northern and western cities. Cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia specifically got huge influxes of African American populations, which you still actually see the impact of the Great Migration on these cities' populations today, especially certain neighborhoods. About 9 out of 10 African Americans lived in the South at the end of World War I, but due to lack of employment opportunities and segregation and the deep embedded hatred and racism, especially with the Ku Klux Klan and the growth of that during the 20s, Southern Blacks began to move out of the South and into the North to get better opportunities. But that didn't stop race riots from occurring in this era. Some of the worst race riots occurred, such as in Chicago in 1919. A group of Black teenagers were swimming in the summer in Lake Michigan, and they just, if you've ever been in the ocean or anything that has a current, you know that you get moved along with it. This group of teenagers were swept into the segregated white area of Lake Michigan, and some white kids on the beach, and by kids I mean probably teenagers or young 20s, began throwing rocks at these Black teenagers. The Black teenagers apparently thought it was kind of like playing a game or dodging them, until one rock hit one of the Black teenagers in the head, and he ended up dying. When the police came, no one was arrested for killing this Black teenager, and as a result, rioting broke out in the Black neighborhoods. 38 people ended up being killed, 500 injured, and they were all predominantly African Americans that were killed and injured during this riot. In 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a Black teenager worked as an elevator lift operator, which if you've ever seen videos or movies from 1920s, you've had in those old elevators, you had to have somebody operating them to get them to move. It's not like you just walked in and pushed a button, somebody operated it. A Black teenager was working as one of these elevator operators when something happened, and he kind of slips and he falls, and he grabbed a white woman to kind of brace himself. It wasn't intentional, just kind of, if you slip and fall or get jolted, you try to brace yourself, and that's what he did here. And he ends up getting arrested for grabbing this white woman, and after news gets out that this Black teenager grabbed a white woman, a white crowd arrived at the jail, and they were demanding him so that they could lynch him. but armed African American World War I veterans showed up to the jailhouse to force out the white mob. As a result of this, the white mob got very angry and attacked the Greenwood area of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and burnt it to the ground. Greenwood was the African American neighborhood. We don't know exactly how many people died when the Greenwood neighborhood was burned down. It could have been anywhere between 39 people to several hundred people that died. There were 39 people that are known for sure that died, but there were people that went missing and were never accounted for, and that number went up to several hundred. 30 whole blocks were destroyed in this fire and attack on this neighborhood, and at least 10,000 people were left without homes as a result of this. And then our last real big race riot of the 1920s happened in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. A white woman in Sumner, which was the segregated African American community just outside of Gainesville. A white woman was attacked by who she claimed was a black man. Now, witnesses were claiming that this woman had a tendency to have a visitor that was one of the train workers come visit her when her husband was not home. But that same day that this woman claimed she was attacked, an African American man had escaped working on the chain gang. So if you don't know what a chain gang is, basically you would have prisoners go out working out, clearing brush or whatever, and they would be all chained together. So they called them a chain gang. So because of this black man gets accused of this. So a mob shows up to the community of Rosewood, and what they did was they would light homes on fire. And then as people were fleeing their burning house, they would shoot them. Didn't matter if they were men, women, children, elderly, didn't matter. They would shoot them down, and numerous people ended up getting killed. Like I said, they shot anyone who was fleeing. The one thing, and this will probably be the only thing, if you don't know me, that I would ever really praise the people from that university nearby. People from the college in Gainesville entered into Rosewood and were helping people escape, like opening their car doors and telling people to get in so they could get them out of town and to safety. So some other topics from the 1920s that you might be asked about included the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties. There has been a question about to what extent did the Jazz Age cause the Great Depression? I don't like the wording of that question, because when I think Jazz Age, I think culture, and the culture, I think you have a harder time arguing the culture caused the Great Depression, but I think what it's really asking you here is the excess of the 1920s. But we'll talk about that when we get to the actual causes of the Great Depression in just a moment. But you'll sometimes hear the 1920s referred to as the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties. But if you see that, think about spending habits, prohibition. So people, not the prohibition thing where people were going to speakeasies, think Great Gatsby-ish, going and drinking in secret clubs with flappers and everything. And there's also this idea during the 1920s that America is in this huge boom time. The economy is going phenomenal. We've got all this money. Things aren't going to go bad. We can just spend, and be successful. And if you don't know how you would write about that more, I am going to be covering that more. So just like the main point of this one is, though, when you see the phrase Jazz Age or Roaring Twenties, don't get confused. Just talk about the economics and how people were spending money, and that will be in our next couple of slides. So towards the end of the 1920s, the economy began to collapse, but there was always signs that it was going to. First of all, there were many key industries that were in trouble because they weren't making a whole lot of money. The main economic or the key economic indicator to determine how your economy is doing is the number of brand new houses being built. The reason for that is that to build a house, you have to have lumbers involved, construction workers are involved. For the 1920s, you're starting to get electrical. So electrical workers, you have to have people pave to get out to your house. You need roofing, you need glass, you need insulation, you need appliances, all those various different industries and all the things that are necessary to, let's say, make those new appliances go into that. Then if you're building a new community, you're going to need roads, which means you're going to also need new gas stations and so on. So number of new houses and new communities being built really shows you how great your economy is doing, because people are also going to be taking out loans to buy new houses as well. So during the 1920s, new home construction dropped quite drastically as the 1920s began to end. Also, farmers were struggling a lot. Crop prices were beginning to drop by around 40%. The main reason why crop prices were dropping was because of overproduction. Farmers were kind of in a lose-lose situation. In order to remain profitable and producing what they needed to do, they had to buy the new farm equipment. New farm equipment, this new capital costs a lot of money, so they would have to take out loans on this to buy these new tractors and new harvesting equipment that could make them more successful and more productive. But the problem with that is that because of this new farm equipment, they were producing more and sending more to market. And this was a lot of farmers all around. So because of more farm goods getting onto the market, prices of those farm goods are going to drop. That's just simple supply and demand. The supply of farm goods and food greatly goes up, which means because there's more of it, the price drops. And that's a problem because in order to buy this new farm equipment that they had to have to be successful, they had to take out loans. So they've taken out these loans that they have to pay back, but now they're making less money, or they're not making as much money as they were before, and they're having difficulty paying off their loans. And whenever you can't pay off your loan to the bank has to try to get their money back somehow. And what they tend to do is they repossess whatever you used as collateral to get this loan, in which case these would have been the actual farms. So banks ended up going and taking farms. So farmers were losing their actual livelihoods because they had taken out these loans and were unable to pay them back. And the bigger problem, how this became even even bigger problem around the country, is that if you have tiny areas and these tiny farming communities, like out in the Midwest or whatever, think maybe Iowa, for instance, you might have one bank servicing an area with a bunch of farmers. And if most of those farmers default on their loans, then banks are going to start collapsing because they don't have any income coming in. So they begin to collapse. So you could have banks failing because they're not, because the farmers in the area aren't able to repay their loans, which means other farmers aren't going to be able to take out any future loans. So it kind of screws over that whole area and gets into a massive economic decline there. Congress initially wanted to help out the farmers by setting up price supports for the federal government to help set price floors down to where the prices on farm goods and crops can't drop below a certain amount. And they also said the government would buy up any surplus and then would sell it themselves. So that way you would keep the farmers afloat and keep the banks afloat. However, President Coolidge vetoed this because he did not believe that it was the federal government's responsibility to get involved this much in the private industries. Consumers also began having less money to spend. So Americans bought less because they had put themselves into debt as well. But first of all, you had prices in other areas started going, other than food, prices started increasing on consumer goods, but their wages weren't going up. So you couldn't, consumers weren't able to purchase things because they didn't have that spending power anymore. Also introduced in the 1920s was this idea of credit, which, you buy now and you pay later. So Americans often were buying goods on credit. So they were racking up all this debt. And because they were buying up, increasing their debt, their spending power also decreased. Once you get so much into debt, you can't buy any more goods. So if you can't buy that brand new appliance that's on the market or buy a brand new car because you already are way too much in debt. So you've had rising prices, stagnant wages, and accumulating debt cause people to start buying fewer things, which is going to hurt businesses and their continued growth of money also throughout the 1920s. Then you get President Hoover winning election in 1928. He was the Republican candidate. He continued a lot of the policies of President Harding and President Coolidge. These were very pro-business policies, but also very much the government doesn't really get involved with the economic issues concerning the individuals. That's the job for the individual to take care of, and charities, which you'll see in just a moment. And one quote that came from Harding I like to bring up because irony is he made a statement that we are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before. He claimed that during his presidency, poverty would be ended by the end of his presidency. And he also promised in his campaign slogan, a chicken in every pot, meaning that everybody's going to have so much money that you can have a whole chicken. Everybody's going to have enough to eat. It's pretty much what he's claiming here. No one's going to go hungry. There'll be a chicken in every pot. But as a result of electing President Hoover. So irony there for you. And then you have issues on the stock market. The Dow Jones is the indicator of how well the stock market was doing throughout the 1920s. The Dow Jones was high because many people were buying stocks. And a lot of the people were buying stocks was through speculation and buying on a margin. So speculation is when you're buying a stock for a certain price and hoping that it's going to make money. So you might buy the most one that I think you guys might be able to understand the most is maybe when you think of Bitcoin. People buying Bitcoin right now, it might be expensive, but you hope that it's going to continue growing. So you're going to dump a lot of money into this Bitcoin, or in this time period, a stock, an expectation that that stock is going to continue growing. But you're also taking a huge risk because there's a possibility that that stock is going to plummet in value. That's speculating, buying up stocks, hoping that they're going to make more money later on, but you're taking that risk that they're going to drop in value. And then buying on a margin. Buying on a margin is pretty much buying stocks on credit. It's you pay 10% of the stock price now and you promise to pay the other 90% off later. This would be phenomenal if, let's say, you buy a $10 stock for $1 now, and then you have to pay that stock off in 5 years. And 5 years down the road, that stock is now worth $100, but you only owe $9 on it because when you bought it, that stock was $10. So that 90% that you owed is still only $9. Now the problem is let's say you buy a stock for $100 or $100 stock for $10 and you have to pay that $90 off later. But in 5 years, that stock is only worth $10. You still owe $90 for that stock that's only worth $10. So if the stock market collapses and you bought all these stocks on a margin, you could cause yourself to go bankrupt because you still have a debt that you have to pay off. It's just that what you owe is a lot more than the value of what you're paying off. So that's a potential danger here and something that comes back to bite a lot of people once the stock market crashes. Some other causes of the Great Depression was the First World War. There's so much debt around the world, especially in Germany. There's so much debt that these European countries especially are trying to remain afloat. And because they don't have the money to spend on excess goods or foreign goods, that there's less trade going on. So businesses that are dependent on foreign trade are going to be struggling during the 1920s due to the First World War. And in the 1920s, the policies were very pro-business, which helps those businesses grow, but when they're not being regulated to make sure that they're actually solvent, so to speak, and can maintain and they're actually the value that their stocks say they are, then that can come back to bite smaller businesses and individuals later on. And that's what actually happens. And then you actually get the stock market crash. In the fall of 1929, stock prices have been falling throughout the fall of 1929, which causes people to just sell off their stocks. And October 29th, 1929 is when the Great Crash happens. This is known as Black Tuesday. There were 16.4 million shares were sold on this date, but there were very few were actually bought, causing the stock market and that Dow Jones number to plummet. And other stocks, whenever you're selling off stocks, it loses value because you have, think also supply and demand. You have a greater supply of those stocks on the market and few people wanting to buy them, so the prices drop. People who did buy stocks were buying stocks on credit, so buying on a margin, and they were left with these massive debts because the values of their stocks just plummeted. And many people on October 29th, 1929 lost all their savings. There were literally people that woke up on October 29th as multimillionaires and went to bed that evening without a dime to their name because they lost so much money in the stock market crash. The stock market crash is often considered the beginning of the Great Depression. It was not the only cause of the Great Depression, but it's really what kind of kicked it into, kicked the economy over the line and into the Depression. So it's one of the causes, but it's not the only cause, and it's really not the greatest cause. There were the other causes of the Great Depression contributed to the stock market crash, and that was just the final straw that broke the economy's back, so to speak. The Great Depression lasted all the way through 1940 into 1941, probably actually all the way into 1941. And it's noted through the economy plummeting and skyrocketed unemployment. Throughout the Depression, you had bank failures, so people panicked and took all their money out of banks. And this is actually a fun story, and that's actually by fun, I mean it's not really that fun. The bank runs were actually caused by one person. One person caused the banking industry to collapse. This unknown man, name has been lost to history, lived in New York City, went to his bank, which was the Bank of the United States, and asked to withdraw all of his stocks and his money from the bank. The bank did not have the money to give him his money, so they declined to give him to pay out to this man. So he went to the New York Times to complain. So the New York Times ran an article about how the banks didn't have the capability to give this man his money. That day, people flooded their banks. As you can see in the picture here, you have a line of people trying to get into their banks, people rushing to their banks to withdraw all their money. The Bank of the United States was specifically named in this article, and by the end of the day, that bank had failed completely and it ceased to exist in a single day. So many of these banks failed because people were unable to get their money. If you were lucky, you got there in enough time to get your money out of the banks, but if you got there too late and all of the bank's money was gone, then you lost all your savings. Anything you had in that bank was gone. And by 1933, 11,000 out of the 25,000 banks in the United States had completely failed. So we lost most of our American banking system. Also contributing to the Depression, production was nearly cut in half from businesses. Economic production very much down. And by 1933, the unemployment rate was 25%. To put that in perspective for you, during the Great Recession of the late 2000s, when unemployment was inching up towards 9%, people were panicking and freaking out, noticing how bad unemployment was and just how people couldn't find jobs and how terrible that was. In the Great Depression, 1933, it was 25%. So that's horrendous unemployment. Unemployment rate right now is really, really good, and we're about 3.7% unemployment. Worldwide, in 1930, what made everything a little bit worse was the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, and this was the largest protective tariff in United States history, still is. The purpose of this is to protect the United States farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. I believe the tariff was about 38%, so think if you had something that cost $100 coming into the United States from a foreign country with this tariff, it's going to now be $138 because of the tax on it. So the effects of this tariff is that unemployment actually increased because of this tariff, because it really killed international trade. Because what happens whenever if the United States puts this worldwide tariff on foreign goods, foreign countries are going to begin putting a tariff just as high on U.S. products coming in. So those businesses that were dependent on foreign countries buying their goods, they're going to greatly suffer as a result of this. And then people that wanted to buy foreign goods, that also is going to be hurting them. So as a result of this, like I said, unemployment increases and worldwide trade actually decreased by 40%. Massive drop. So those countries and other countries that were also experiencing economic difficulties that were dependent on foreign trade, they really, really made it a lot worse for them as well. So to sum up our causes of the Great Depression here, there are tariffs and war debt led to limited foreign demand for American goods. There was the farming crisis, which we discussed, where farmers start losing their farms because they've overproduced and prices were too low. It was extremely easy to get credit and to buy things on credit. And by people buying things on credit, they accumulated debt that they couldn't pay off. And as a result of having too much debt, they quit buying new things. There was also an unequal distribution of income. The wealthy were extremely wealthy and poor people were not, there wasn't really a middle class yet, but people who weren't extremely wealthy, they weren't making more money with this supposed economic boom of the 1920s because their wages remained stagnant. So the rich got richer and everybody else just stayed the same or got poorer. All of these factors caused consumer demand to decrease during the 1920s. Consumer demand decreases, businesses begin to suffer. The government was also keeping interest rates low in order to encourage businesses and individuals to keep borrowing. If interest rates are low, you're more likely to take out a loan because it's cheaper for you to take that loan out. So as a result of that, businesses kept taking out loans and individuals kept taking out loans, and that built up their debt, which when you have, once again, you have too much debt, you're not going to be buying other goods. And some of this borrowed money was used to buy stocks, and these borrowing money to buy stocks and increased speculation caused businesses, their values to be overblown because so many people were wanting to buy their stocks when their company really shouldn't have been, stock prices shouldn't have been as high as they were. Their companies weren't really as valuable as they were. And when the stock market crashed, it led to a lot of people losing everything. So it was a whole lot of mess, due in large part due to a lack of regulation.